now. Hello, everybody. My name is David Kramer. I am director of the library at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And it has been our pleasure for years, and particularly this difficult year, for us to sponsor book talks and other programming, other cultural programming that have been very, very rich over the course of the year. We've actually got one more coming up during this season, but we're approaching the end of the season, and we are grateful that you have joined us. Let me begin with technical matters. I ask you please to remain on mute. If you stray off of it for one reason or the other and I hear you, I will just seek you out on the list and mute you to make sure that our author is not bothered in her presentation, and there will be time for questions and discussion at the end. So in terms of the questions, I think that despite the fact that we are a manageable size crowd where it's occasionally possible to even have a discussion or for people to ask their own questions on Zoom, I still think it'll be cleaner if we restrict the questions to chat. Please direct them either to everyone or to me, and I will keep track of the questions and I will direct them to Jennifer then when the time comes for those questions. Let me begin by placing this talk in the context of the library and our programming. As I said to you before we began, Jennifer, when fewer people were on, the reason the reason it was so important for us to have a program like this is because the Jewish Theological Seminary does have a Jewish education school, and we train professionals to work in all kinds of educational settings. And needless to say, one of the most difficult things that they are challenged by is how to educate in connection to the Holocaust in the broad sense of the terms, in the history that led to it, the details of the Holocaust itself and so forth. And you in your book touch on the early years before the horrors emerged in their fullest capacity. But this is something that we take seriously, and we in the library support our education program, both with the acquisition of professional books that will help them to study and prepare to be educators, but also we will purchase literature that is appropriate in schools at various levels. And this will certainly be included in that group. So I'm very, very thrilled. As you said in your early messages to me, your presentation is appropriate for young people, for their parents, for their teachers, and for everybody in between. I know when I hear people wondering about the value of fiction and narrative, I often think, why is that a question? Because in order for us to be our best selves as human beings, we have to be able to imagine ourselves in the place of the other. And one of the things that you do in this book is to help the reader imagine themselves on both sides of this very, very difficult historical setting. Both a young person who is Jewish and a young person who is a German on the German side, and the challenge of appreciating what that means is something you take up. It's a very, very difficult thing to make sense of, and we're grateful to you for having provided that access. So I'm going to let the author begin. You're not here to listen to me, but to her, and I will spotlight her, and she will share her screen. And so please enjoy, and we'll get to questions when she tells us that the time has come. Jennifer, please.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm thrilled to connect with your community. So welcome everyone to my author talk. I appreciate you logging on. I'm very excited to be able to speak with you. My name is Jennifer Voigt Kaplan, and I'm a children's book writer. So today I'll give you a little bit of background about myself, my debut novel, the research I conducted, and also outline some writing techniques that I personally find useful. So my debut middle grade novel, Crushing the Red Flowers, it was released last year by a small press, Ig Publishing. It's been endorsed by James Patterson, and I'm really thrilled to say that it won the 2020 Christopher Award in the Books for Young People category. So the novel is set in 1938 Germany, and it's about how two ordinary children cope under the extraordinary circumstances of the pogrom we call Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass. The story's fictional, but it is based on true family experiences. The book, it alternates perspectives between two 12-year-olds. Emil is a German Jewish boy, and Friedrich, he is a boy in Hitler's Jungvolk. And I wrote the book because my heritage is half German and half German Jewish. The novel starts and stops in 1938, and I very specifically chose to structure the story this way to provide middle grade readers a solid introduction to the factors that led up to World War II and to the Holocaust. So let's get started. First, I'll just give you a quick background about me as a writer and my path to writing. It was long and winding. I was born in Germany, and I was introduced to two languages, German and English, very early on. When I moved to the United States when I was about 3, I was introduced to a third language, Hebrew, when I attended a Jewish day school for a few years. And I had always been creative and I love storytelling, but it really wasn't until I was an adult that I really got my footing in language and I started writing. And I've always had a lot of ideas. It's really too many ideas, and I never knew what to do with them until I started dabbling in writing. I began to write picture books just for my own children, just for enjoyment. And then a few years went by, and I got a little bit more serious about learning the craft, and I moved to short stories, which are really great because they teach someone the art of beginnings, middles, and ends. And that ultimately helped me to springboard my way into writing novels. And writing just felt right. It was the first creative pursuit that gave me a way to organize my literally hundreds of ideas. So writing tip number 1, from the very beginning, I created what I call an idea repository, which every author does this. It's basically one big document. I use Excel, and it has a million tabs to house all of my thoughts. I have pages for character traits and plot ideas and cool verbs and great lines and weird concepts and anything and everything that I can use in my writing. And it also gave me a way to capture my ideas before they disappeared. I've been blessed with an overactive creative muse, but she's a very fickle creative muse, and she's super productive at weird times and never productive at the right times when I want her to be. So when she's working, I need to make sure that I capture everything that she says, because if I don't, I'll forget it. So getting back to finding my way to novel writing, for me, based on my family heritage, it was clear that Crushing the Red Flowers would have to be my first novel. As I mentioned, I'm half German and I'm half German Jewish. And I grew up with a sort of multi-layered understanding in the United States of what Jewish and non-Jewish residents of Germany faced during World War II. And advice 101 for any writer is to use what you know. And the material in this book, in Crushing the Red Flowers, was something that I knew because it was my own family history and heritage. And I was inspired by all these stories I heard growing up around the dinner table and from my family. And I tried to include as many as possible. And I'm not going to give away any huge spoilers in my talk because I know not everybody listening has read my book. So I'll just give you one small example. I had grown up hearing this one family story that it was sad, but at the same time, it was really funny to me. And I felt like I needed to document it. Apparently my great-grandmother had a cousin who was quarantined for some kind of illness. And apparently by the end of his isolation, he went a little bonkers and he used to catch flies and he'd paint them all different colors of the rainbow and just let them zip around the room just for entertainment. And I got a kick out of that story. I thought it was so funny, and it did take me a while, but I figured out a subtle way to just add it into my novel. So another reason why I wanted to write about this particular time period was growing up in the United States. I often experienced a lot of misunderstanding about World War II from my peers. And I felt like I wanted to better address that. I received a lot of questions that surprised me about German people as well as about Jewish people. So when I was preparing to write my novel, I looked at what was available in the market at the time, and there wasn't all that much middle grade World War II literature overall. I'm not sure there was anything really focused just on Kristallnacht for this particular age group, and there were very few children's novels that used German main characters. So one of my favorite quotes on writing is by Toni Morrison, and she says, if there is a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And that's what I did. So as I wrote, the project evolved, and I started out originally wanting to capture meaningful portions of my own family history. But I also wanted to explore the factors that led up to World War II. And I wanted to shed light on the evolution of hate. And I wanted to give these younger middle grade readers an authentic introduction to the Holocaust with diverse points of view, all while not overly distressing them. And importantly, I wanted to invite my younger readers to reflect on their own lives. And I wanted them to think about learning from our past and think about how we can all move forward. Okay, so let's talk about research. A lot of people have asked me about the research I conducted, and I really like talking about this topic. I felt from the beginning that if I was going to take on a Holocaust project, which is a project about one of the most disturbing periods of our history, that I needed to make sure that my research was solid. I needed to proceed with extra care, and I needed to commit to not taking any shortcuts. So as I mentioned, my family story served as the foundation and inspiration of Crushing the Red Flowers, but I conducted so much additional research beyond that. When I started on the novel, I was fortunate that I still had 4 family members who were still with me who had lived through that era. I had my 2 German Jewish maternal grandparents and my paternal German aunt and uncle. And all 4 of these people were huge champions of the project. And the interviews that I conducted with them as step 1 became really the foundation of my novel. I then tried to learn everything and anything I could about 1938 Germany. I read nonfiction and children's fiction and adult fiction. I read academic articles. But then still, as I worked on the novel, I had very specific questions emerge, like how exactly did the events of Kristallnacht unfold? How quickly could someone leave Germany after securing a visa? What foods were becoming hard to obtain? So I broadened my scope of sources, and I contacted historians like Myrna Goldenberg, professor emerita of Holocaust history at Montgomery College, and Dr. Patricia Herber-Rice from the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. But then even after that, I had some very, very specific questions that I needed answers to, like what was the weather like on certain dates, or what fish could swim in the Leine River? What month did poppies wilt in Germany? And I continued my research to gain a richer sense of German style and interiors, and just really the general mood of the 1930s. I watched movies from the time period. I browsed through portraits housed at the Center for Jewish History in New York. I even watched old 1930s political video clips. So I'll give you a specific example. One time I had a very, very, very specific question about what German wallpaper in the 1930s looked like. And I couldn't find the answer in any of my sources, and I didn't just want to make assumptions. So I hopped on the train to New York. I live in New Jersey. I hopped on the train to New York, and I went to the New York Public Library picture collection. And there I was able to browse through hundreds of images of German interiors for the 1930s until I got my answer. And that bit of research took a day, and then it all got boiled down to, I think, one word, which was, like swirly or something like that. But moving on, People also often ask me about my characters, and the majority of Crushing the Red Flowers characters are completely fictional. To me, they're sort of a representation of a place and time. Again, I'll discuss this without giving away any big spoilers, so don't worry. The character Emil, he is one of the two main characters. His sister and father, named Sarah and Fati, are fictional. Friedrich is the other main character, and his papa are fictional as well. And with these characters, I tried to capture a certain kind of warmth and really like a certain degree of coldness that I myself have sometimes felt growing up in relation to both my Jewish and my German roots. The side character Ari is totally fictional, but he was inspired by stories of how my grandfather and my grandmother were treated and how they thought about it when some of their childhood friends began to distance themselves from them because they were Jewish. Gunther and the Young Folk Boys, they're the villains of the story. They're completely made up, and I used historical research to help assemble each character. Mama, who is Emil's mother, is fictional, but her warmth, her physical appearance, her loving marriage to her husband, they were all inspired by stories that my grandfather told me about his mother. Mother, who is the mother of Friedrich, he's the other of the two main characters, is completely fictional, but she remains one of the most interesting characters to me. She compulsively cleans, and she is teetering on the edge of madness. To me, she sort of represents a part of the German subconscious. So years ago, I once read this really fascinating article about mental illness in women through the years. It wasn't about World War II or the Holocaust. It was about women mental illness throughout the years. And it compared conditions commonly associated with women like mid-century agoraphobia, modern-day eating disorders. And what was really interesting to me was how the author explored that each of these conditions was manifesting itself in a way that was supposed to be like an exaggerated version of the supposedly ideal woman of that particular time. And I found that notion fascinating. And I used that logic to create Mother's Condition. I imagine what the ideal German woman in 1938 would be like, which I think would be someone who followed orders and served her family and kept a very, very, very clean house. And then I used that to create her disorder. So if the characters are fictional and are just vaguely inspired by a true characteristic here and there, then how, you may ask, do I develop them? And I use something called a characterization grid, which is pretty much what every writer does. So for the tweens and teens out there, if anybody's out there listening, perhaps you've done this for your own school writing projects. I have to mention that if you're not a writer, I'm told that hearing about these writing techniques are still interesting. But if you are a writer, a middle or high schooler, or a parent of a middle or high schooler, I'm told that these techniques are actually useful. So what this characterization grid means is that I basically create a full write-up on each and every character before I start to write. And I'll show you what I mean by sharing my screen. So you should be seeing something called a characterization grid. And if not, somebody please holler if we're not seeing it, but I think you're seeing it.
Oh, you're good. It's there.
Okay, super. Okay. So when I do school visits, I really go into depth. When I work with the kids, I have them fill this out, but I'll just briefly give you an overview right now. So I start with the basics like name and age and what they look like, any speech or physical mannerisms. And then I think about what my character is like, stuff like strengths and weaknesses and hobbies and friends or prized possessions. And finally, I really get to know them by fleshing out things like what are they most proud of? What are their most embarrassing moments? What are their secrets? And most importantly, what are their wants, desires, and goals? And this is really the stuff that propels any novel forward. So doing this not only helps me develop my characters, but it also helps me flesh out my plot. And I will mention that I think it's important to do this for all characters, not just the main characters. I made this mistake when I first started writing the novel. I had only worked out my two main characters, Emil and Friedrich. Then a little while into writing, I went through this exercise for all of my side characters, and I got some really great stuff. Again, I won't give away any spoilers, but I did it for the character Mother, Friedrich's mother, who I just mentioned. And I found out that she has a huge secret, and I'm sure I knew this secret all along in my subconscious, but it really didn't come out until I went through this writing exercise. And her secret made it into the book, and I do think the book is that much better for it. So while we're on the topic of writing tools, in addition to this characterization grid, I also love using something called a Post-it note plotter as a writing tool. So you should be viewing that now. I find visual plotting to be extremely helpful. And what I do is I basically just take a large poster board and a lot of different colored Post-it notes, and I map out everything before I even start to write. And this process can take days or weeks or months, but I would not shortcut this. So what I do for setting, there's a big pale yellow Post-it on top, and I use that to capture the setting. Then for characters, I use blue Post-it notes, one for each character. For general plot, I use these brighter yellow Post-it notes. For questions and things I still need to figure out, I use purple Post-it notes. And it's okay if you don't know every little thing. I actually think that it's good to keep a degree of spontaneity in your novel as you write. And then for the big plot twists, I use orange Post-it notes. And these are really the most important. You capture your inciting incident, the climax, the plot twist, and any other big plot events that keep your reader surprised at the edge of their seats. And so I actually use this Post-it note plotting board not only as a plotting tool, but also as a diagnostic tool that helps me identify problems early on, even before I start to write. So specifically, I make sure I have plenty of these orange Post-it notes scattered throughout. And if I don't see an orange one after a few chapters, I know my writing is sagging and I need to beef up the plot. So what you're looking at now is a very early visual for a brand new novel, not Crushing the Red Flowers, but a brand new novel. And it told me I had a problem. There absolutely weren't enough orange Post-it notes. So I'll show you what a later version looks like. And this may look like a hot mess, but all of this stuff is in a writer's head. So this is the best way to organize it. I enjoy working old school with a physical Post-it note and physical paper so you can move them around easily. It's much more populated, this version. It has more notes on my character's internal journey and the book's external plot. But it still remains just as helpful with diagnosing plot problems. For example, I can sort of see an area that would benefit by adding a plot point. And if you can see my cursor, that's the area that quickly jumps out at me. Okay, moving on. I'm often asked about what I like to use for writing inspiration, and the answer is many things. But I do use other art forms for inspiration, especially writing about emotions. So what I mean by other art forms, it could be music or visual arts, it could be like paintings, photography, sculptures, or it could be performing arts like theater or dance. And so, for example, let's take paintings. What I do is I look at a piece that I've had a connection with, and then I ask myself, why am I having an emotional response? And I dissect it. And when I move from the emotional to the analytical, that's when I can better observe and describe. And there are so many advantages to using art to feed writing. For one, a place or experience may become accessible when it otherwise would not have been. So for example, let's take a look at this painting. It's a painting, it's Dawn Hudson's Country Cottage. So if you're writing a story about a cottage in the woods, but you can't actually get to a cottage in the woods, how will you know how to describe a cottage in your writing? And you'll probably already have some kind of mental image, but by dissecting a painting or photograph of a cottage that you like, you may find additional sensory details like soft lighting illuminating from within, or a winding path to an entrance, or fragrant flowers, window boxes, or you know how smoke billows from the chimney, or the birds nesting in the thatched roof. You may notice details about the cottage's surroundings, like maybe how tall the evergreen trees are and how it's towering over the cottage and it blocks the sun. Or you may even pick up cues about what you would hear, like birds or rustling leaves or water or chatter. And all of these details inform descriptions in writing. And you can also use portraits. Let me show you this one, which I love to use because it's by Rembrandt, and it's called Portrait of Herman Dumer. And I love showing this to kids when I present to kids because it was painted in 1640. And it's the facial expression of the man that really caught my eye. I still can't decide exactly what this man is thinking, but he definitely sees something in the viewer that surprises him. The man is peering into our soul, the viewer's soul, as if he knows what we're thinking. Um, and he's just now seeing something new. So to me, the expression is even a little bit snarky, and it could mean a lot of things, but to me, he sort of looks like he just caught me doing something I'm not supposed to be doing. It kind of looks like the next words are, you know, you're so busted. But this is the kind of look that one of my characters, Emil, who's good-natured, but you know, sometimes lacking in common sense, he would have gotten this look a lot from adults. So how can we use portraits in writing? Well, if you're writing about an adult catching you in a lie, you find a painting that reminds you of the look that you would get, and you dissect the facial expression. In this case, you could mention the eyes. They're sort of alert and piercing. His mouth is sort of agape. The laugh lines around his eyes and mouth are pronounced, and he sort of looks like it's the beginning of a smirk. And this painting is about 400 years old, but you can use it to describe your character's body language in your writing today. All right, so I will stop sharing. You should be seeing me. So when I was writing Crushing the Red Flowers, I used art in a number of ways, and I also used music for inspiration. As you know, most Jewish people in Germany were fairly integrated into society before the 1930s, and policies and attitudes certainly began shifting throughout the 30s, but very, very abruptly, all within the year 1938. Jewish people experienced radical changes, and specifically the government took steps to weaken the position of Jewish people, a group of their own citizens, and they did this by using economic and social tactics, not just political tactics. And I'm going to list off some of these in a second, but if you wanted to reflect more on this, you can review a timeline that I've compiled of selected events on my website under educational resources. My website is jennifervk.com. That's Jennifer, V as in Victor, K as in Kaplan.com. So I'm going to read you a list. Mind you, all of these happened just in the year 1938 alone. Okay, so in 1938, Jews were prohibited from having driver's license. They were banned from public streets on certain days. They were forced to register wealth and property, register their businesses, were prohibited from trading, were forced to carry ID cards, were prohibited from practicing medicine, were required to add Sarah if a woman and add Israel if a man to their names on all legal documents. They were prohibited from all legal practices, were forced to have passports stamped with a large J, were fully expelled from German schools, and were no longer permitted to attend universities. That's a lot. And thinking about all this as I wrote, I was influenced by a musical piece by Bohuslav Martinu. He was a Czech composer who was blacklisted by the Nazis because he composed a tribute to a Czech resistance force. So during the war, he made his way over to the United States. And while he was here, he had a very odd accident where he fractured his skull. So he was in pain for some time. And during this period, he wrote a piece called The Three Madrigals. And it's a beautiful piece, but the piece is riddled in irritability and frustration. And listening to it, it reminded me of what the German Jewish people must have felt in 1938 as they systematically had their freedoms taken away. So I also used photographs for inspiration. In my research, I found some fantastical photos that illustrated what people went through before the war. Germany, as you're aware, was financially devastated after the First World War, and we really saw this manifest itself during a period of hyperinflation in the early 1920s, where money became nearly worthless, and it was so bad that people were using banknotes to wallpaper their homes because it was cheaper than using actual wallpaper. Waiters had to announce new menu prices throughout the day because the inflation was so radical. Workers had to bring sacks and wheelbarrows to collect their wages. And Germans eventually, my understanding is that Germans eventually tried to avoid currency altogether, and they just started bartering for goods. So I will share my screen again. Okay, and I'll show you a quick picture. I found a few photographs from around 1922, 1923. One was of children using thousands and thousands of bundled banknotes or money as building blocks. Another, which is this one, was of boys flying a kite made of banknotes. And you may ask yourself, okay, your book is about 1938. Why are you talking about 1923? And that is a fair question. 1938 is about 15 years later than the period of hyperinflation. So many of the children that I saw in these photos would have been decision makers and maybe even parents by 1938. And my feeling is that if I'm going to write about what happened in 1938, I needed to understand what happened before and specifically how desperate times had gotten for the Germans. And these images gave me insight into the mentality of time. Specifically, they gave me a glimpse into what the people who ushered in Adolf Hitler had gone through when they were children. And that was important for me to understand as I wrote my book. So lastly, I wanted to mention how I use paintings from that era for inspiration. And there are quite a few, but I'll mention two in particular. Let me show you this one, which is my favorite. I found a self-portrait by Oskar Kokushka, and he's an Austrian artist. He painted this in 1937. So while the story goes, while he was painting a self-portrait of himself, he learned that a number of his other pieces were included in the Nazis' degenerative art exhibition. And he was obviously affronted, and his response was to change directions of his self-portrait. So he continued painting it, but he crossed his arms in defiance, and he portrayed himself staring directly at the viewer, which was unusual at the time. And he changed the title of this painting to Self-Portrait of a Degenerative Artist. And this act of defiance was quite powerful for me to read about. For the purposes of my novel, it was important for me to understand how the everyday person resisted the Nazis. And there's been movies made and books written about large-scale acts of resistance, but for the everyday person, resistance took many forms, and I find that incredibly compelling. So for my book, I needed to understand how a 12-year-old boy could resist, or how a housewife could resist, how everyday citizens and everyday jobs could resist. So with Kokushka's self-portrait, we see a painter resist as he knew how. That was through paintings, and I found that very powerful. And the last painting I'd like to show you, there we go. It's called Paris Society by Max Beckmann, and it was painted in 1931. Max Beckmann, he was a German painter, and he painted this particular painting from an invitation from the German embassy in Paris. And he actually started to sketch this in the late 1920s. And by the time it was completed in 1931, times had changed so much that he was accused of slander. And it's a portrait of businessmen and intellectuals at a black tie party. And as you can see, it looks and feels very disjointed and incoherent and muddled. The postures are kind of jerky, and the clothing apparently is strange for the time period. Something is just not right with it. And to me, this painting captures a society in the midst of change and confusion, right as Hitler was being ushered in. And I used these feelings of uncertainty and turmoil not only when I thought about the German subconscious when I was writing my book, but also newly clouded German Jewish identity in the 1930s. And I try to inject this overwhelming sentiment of confusion in both the German and the Jewish adult characters. All right. Okay, so that's it for the parents or educators out there. I did want to mention that I've included a discussion guide at the back of the book. I've also created a much lengthier educator's guide. It's a 13-page guide with a lot more additional research and opportunities. It's a good way to start conversations. It's available for free download on my website. Thank you so much for listening. It was a pleasure to present to you all. If you are interested in purchasing my book, you can purchase it any place books are sold. I'm always in favor of supporting the small local bookstore. If they don't have it in stock, I'm sure they would be happy to order it for you. But of course, it is available online at Amazon for convenience. And if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take them.
I'm sure we'll have questions. That was fantastic, Jennifer, and really, modeling how to organize one's move forward from just preliminary ideas to actually creating a book. I'm sure for potential writers of any age is of value. I wonder though, before I take questions from those who are here, if you can say just a little bit more. I know you said you wanted to avoid spoiling, kind of plot surprises and the like, but if you could say something broad about the substance of the narrative, I think people who haven't had a chance to read the book would appreciate that.
Sure. So as I mentioned, I have alternating perspectives, a German Jewish boy and a boy in a Hitler Youth. And I stay true to that structure throughout the book. It's a linear timeline. It progresses from roughly the summer of 1938 through December, where so much stuff has happened. And you see an evolution of both characters as their situation unravels, and they're sort of tied to each other as the book progresses.
And are we asked to be sympathetic to them both?
That is my hope.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great.
But that is the reader's choice.
Always. Okay, good. Since I'm going to be conveying the questions to you, I'm going to add myself to the screen, and I invite people to ask questions. One question we got in the course of your presentation was what grades would the book be best for? And we've since gotten a question, so I'll give you, this one as well. If you could say something about the title. How did you come up with the title? So that's what we have so far.
Okay. So I think ideally it's sixth grade. The book is technically marketed as 10 and up. That it was determined by my publisher, not by me. I'm more comfortable with 11 and up just based on the maturity of my own 3 children. But that's really something a parent or an educator needs to decide. So, it could be as young as 5th grade. 6th and 7th grade are ideal. Many of the adults who have read the book who don't read children's literature can't believe it's a children's book because they say, wow, I really like that when they're not familiar with children's literature. So, I think it's really appropriate for literally 10 and up.
Okay, and the title?
Okay, so the crushing the red flower is the poppy. If you have ever been in Europe, many countries in Europe, including Germany, that wild poppies grow beautifully and rampantly in fields. And so the title originally, it's a small detail. It came out of an interview with my maternal grandfather that he does remember as a youth going through the fields and maybe being on a train or going through the fields and really marveling at the beauty of the poppies. And this struck me as something not, a 12-year-old boy or a teenage boy would usually marvel at. So it must have really resonated with him. So I just remember that detail since, young boys usually aren't wowed by the beauty of it. So meanwhile, as you're aware, the poppy is really a symbol of World War I and the battles of World War I. So I took some liberties, and there was a very specific economic and social and political culture between the wars, World War I and World War II. So I kind of took liberties and I stretched, the symbolism of the World War I, and I used that to symbolize that entire culture spanning between the 2 wars. And once we saw Hitler rise to power in the early 30s, everything changes politically, economically, socially, and that was really the end. So crushing the red flowers is really the end of that very distinct period.
You just referenced your personal story and spoke about it at the beginning. Was it unusual for Jewish Germans and non-Jewish Germans to marry during the period that ultimately produced you? What was how did you experience the perceptions of the war on both sides of the family?
Thank you for asking that question because times have changed so much. It's easier now, but it was always a conversation. It was highly unusual. I've actually I've only met a handful of people who are Israeli and German, modern day. And I don't think anyone growing up, I had never met anyone growing up in my situation. So the very brief story is that my Jewish maternal grandparents made it out of Germany. They left in the late 30s and early 40s. They found themselves in Philadelphia and they were married in the United States. They had my mother, German Jewish descent. She was born in the United States. She went to Penn State. Meanwhile, my father is a German Christian, and he had always been adventurous, loved international adventures, and he decided to go to Penn State as a study abroad student. My parents met at Penn State. Afterwards, my mother decided to move to Germany because she did feel as though she had German roots, I suppose, and they lived there for about a decade. But yeah, it all, if you grow up in that situation, it makes complete sense. And if you don't, it's usually, a couple of questions that you have to explain that seem so intuitive if you grow up into it.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Vicky wants to know, were the two boys friends?
Oh, okay, I'll give you a little information, but if I speak too much, I think that would give away like a spoiler. No, they don't really know each other, and they meet during that time period. It was based on interviews with my family. There was a separation of friendships occurring by 1938. So my German Jewish family had plenty of Christian friends as younger children, but by 1938, people were pulling away from them. So it would not have been a popular, well-regarded thing for a boy in the Hitler Youth to befriend a Jewish boy. So they actually met accidentally. I'm only going to give you a little bit, but they met haphazardly at a private location by the creek, and the relationship sort of evolves, where I wouldn't say they're friends, but I say as time goes on, there's a very specific mutual respect. And that's all I'm saying about it. You have to read the book.
Okay, but that gives something. That's great. Helene says that in her experience, children who don't have the background of history can miss a lot when they're reading historical fiction.
Yeah.
That it might be difficult for them. How do you feel about that in connection to this book and your general approach to writing for young people, something they might not know very much about?
Yeah, that's a very fair question, and I had thought that who my audience would be, and I think the wider audience may not be Jewish, and so I needed to be very careful. A word like Shabbat, which is so rich and meaningful to any Jewish person with smells and foods and family and love, means absolutely nothing. And even if you explain it, it's like a half of a sentence. So I had to be very careful about how I introduce things. I hope I was successful. I do a lot of school visits, and most of the questions indicate to me that they're getting it. So that's quite good. There's also, again, in the back of the book, I included a discussion guide right in the back of the book. But if any, a parent or an educator really would like to foster more discussion, I did create this, enormous 13-page discussion guide to really help the child, sort of learn about the era.
Okay. One of our listeners observes that poppies have a dark underside, right? They are opium, right?
Yeah, that's true.
And that may be reflected in the 1931 painting that you showed, which seems filled with tension and discord. How do you respond to that kind of observation?
Wow, I love that. Whoever gave that comment, I love that comment. That's something I'm
Shared.
actually gonna not respond to and just think about later on my own. That was a good look at the painting some more. Fantastic.
There's always more to see in a painting, right? That's
Yeah, yeah.
That's great. Good. Okay, anybody else? Give everybody just another minute if there are other questions. If not, we'll thank you and go ahead. Anybody else? Okay, well, this is, I must say, I mean, you told me when we first spoke that you would focus as much on the process of writing, and you speak as an educator. I mean, really helping others, and that's just wonderful.
Thank
In
you.
that capacity, this is of enormous interest and relevance to any age that finds their way into a library. So I'll express our gratitude to you for that. You all know how to purchase books these days. It's too bad we can't be in person to have you sign it, but maybe the time will come. And I hope that, yeah, I hope I speak for others in saying that I wish you success both in this book and with, you know, the educational purpose that it serves, and look forward to future books. Will you always write for young people, or do you imagine writing novels for adults as well?
So in the immediate future, I think my heart belongs to children's literature. You know, there has been, I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, I'm inundated with creative ideas. And so I definitely have snippets of adult themed projects that I could pursue. None of them have been compelling enough for me to do it. I like to also dabble, I still dabble in picture books. It's such a sweet, sweet, hopeful age, which is roughly like the 4 to 8 range. I just did my first nonfiction manuscript. I'm still, you know, finishing that off. That was something radically new. But that's ages 6 to 10, about, you know, the Revolutionary War. I really gravitate to middle grade. This like sixth, seventh age range is such a hopeful, interesting age to me, where children are really starting to become the people who they are. So I think that's my true heart, you know, and I can go a little above, a little below, maybe adult, like in the distant future. I'll never say never, but not right now.
Well, it sounds great. Anything that might have a Jewish related theme, let us know so that we can make sure it's in our collection. And I want to thank everybody for joining us as we approach the end of this season. Really, it's been rich, and each presentation in its own way. I also want to thank our assistants, our executive assistants in the library, who has helped make all of this possible. Berenice Silverin, we're grateful to you as well. So I wish everybody well, have a good evening, and we hope to see you at other library programs in the future. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Sure.